So I'm going to go ahead and take a few questions. I have a couple of here. I'm going to read the question. Let's see, the first one says, have banks not receiving the bailout benefited since they weren't looked down upon by the public? Have banks not receiving the bailout benefit? Okay, so in other words, are banks that didn't take TARP funds viewed better than those that did? And I don't think the answer, I think the answer to that is very simply that I don't think that banks are really judged on whether or not they took TARP funds, because at the time, in fact, many banks that had the option of not taking TARP were advised by their counselors, their attorneys, their advisors of various types to take it, because the banks that weren't getting TARP were the ones that weren't strong enough, in the opinion of the government, to pay it back. So in many cases, banks took the TARP money even though they didn't need it. Many of them have paid it back by now, but I don't think that's a big issue. All right, next question. What legislation has been enacted to prevent this from happening, and how is it affecting banking? You know, I'm going to give you an opinion, and I'll tell you the same thing that I tell everybody else when I speak in front of groups. What I say is just my opinion, and so I will tell you that the legislation that's been enacted over the last year is very detrimental to banks, and it is going to slow down the bank's recovery. What they've done is it's extraordinarily complicated. There are bills that are 1,000 pages long, and the bill is just the starting point. The way that the bill is really instituted in day-to-day life is through the legislative, not the legislative, but through the regulatory agencies. And so the regulatory agencies take the law and they look at it and they say, what do we think that Congress meant by this? And the problem with much of the legislation that the previous Congress, prior to this, the new one that just took their role in January, was that they would say things in there like, banks must meet an acceptable level of blank, or banks must not exceed certain levels of blank. Well, they did that on purpose. They did it to leave plenty of room for the regulators to be extremely heavy-handed, and in that process, I believe that they will end up creating a situation that will hurt banks in the long run. That's simply my opinion. I'm not speaking on behalf of anybody else or as a representative of anybody. That's just my simple opinion. I would say that there will need to be some changes to the legislation at some point, or we will lose literally thousands of more banks in this country. All right, next question. How do you envision the banking industry changing as online microloans become more popular? Okay, good. You know, microloans, that's a very interesting industry. And I actually met a man. I go to banking school in Philadelphia. Last summer was my first. I'm going back again this summer. And one of the folks that I met there is from Iraq. And he is a native-born Iraqi, and he is actually in the microloan business. So I talked to him about the challenges that they face there, and they're very similar to the challenges that we face here in the United States in terms of microloans. Microloans, at least the online version, sound great on paper. They look at, they don't lend too much money. The problem, of course, is that you can only do so much with a $500 loan or a $2,500 loan. You really have to charge a pretty hefty interest rate in order to make any money on that, even up to a $25,000 loan. And that's the largest micro loan I've ever seen. The average loan that I do is probably somewhere in the $400,000 or $500,000 range. So it costs me just as much money from my time, the administrator's time, etc., to do a $500,000 loan as it does to do a $5,000 loan. So from that perspective, they're going to have I don't think they're going to be a big competitor to the big banks that are lending at 4, 5, 6, 7% when they have to charge 15, 20, 25% just to be competitive. So I don't think that that's going to be a big issue, and I hope I'm answering your question. If not, just let me know. All right, next question. Was part of the reason for housing market crash because the government pushed banks to give bad loans? You know, again, I want to be very careful. I do want to give an opinion, and I want to be firm in my opinion. I want to say that the banks, the individuals and the institutions that packaged these loans into MBOs and created the frothiness of the MBO market, they did so and made billions and billions of dollars on it, and they were thrilled to do it. And so one of the arguments that was made, though, was that they would have never even gotten into that had the government not forced them. Now, one thing that you can do, I'm going to give you this blog site, and I tell people I'm not nearly cool enough to have a blog, but I do. And one of the reasons I did so was to support speaking events just like this one, so that you can go and read more about it and have more input. So it's I'm going to give you the site now. It's bankingwithjimmy.wordpress.com, and that's the site. You can go there, look at the first 2 posts, which is Subprime Primer 1 and 2, which was written in 2008, both of them, and they'll give you a pretty good insight into that question. Look at excuse me, I'm blanking on the name of the legislation. It was called the Community Reinvestment Act. So check that out, and you'll see what happened was it went from telling banks that they had to be fair about their lending to telling banks that they had to go into certain communities that they knew they were going to take a loss in. The government knew they were going to take a loss in, but they put political pressure on them and allowed certain community groups to do the same thing. I'm not saying that the banks shouldn't have been there already. I'm not saying that they shouldn't have been more proactive about it. Absolutely they should. But yes, there's some element of the government inserting themselves that did lead to some of the issues. I will say that, again, the banks loved making all that money, and they weren't complaining about it too much at the time. All right, next question. What is the future of banking? How will banks ensure stability? You know, I think we're going to go back to a situation where you have a certain minimum level of credit underwriting that hasn't taken place for many years. My bank is Fidelity Bank. It's a community bank headquartered here in Atlanta. We trade under the ticker symbol of LION, L-I-O-N. And if you go back and you look at our stock price, if you track the stock price, we went way down. But as we've continued to make money over the last 6 years, it's come up at 6 quarters. It has come up back to a reasonable point, but it's still not nearly what it was, and it's not going to be there. It may not be there, I should say, anytime soon. So the reason that we're still around, and I'm trying to answer your question by explaining why we're still here. We're one of the strongest banks in Georgia, and we're very well respected. And sure, we took our lumps. Absolutely, we took our lumps. And we took a lot of losses and lost a lot of money. But we did not take nearly as much as most of these banks. And the reason is because we had the types of credit underwriting that you're supposed to have in normal times. We maintained those over the last several years, or throughout our 37-year history. We required certain things that other banks weren't requiring, and even to this day, I'm seeing other banks that are still sloppy and shoddy with their underwriting. The regulators simply do not have the resources to monitor every single thing that every bank is doing. So banks are going to have to self-police in many ways. I would say that in the long term, stability will be in the eye of the beholder. And I would say that long term that banks will see cycles. They will be up, they'll be stable again in 3 or 4 years, and then there'll be a time, I don't know if it's 8 years, 10 years, 20 years from now, they won't be stable again. So you cannot legislate stability into the banking market without crushing it to the point where you just don't have any activity in the banking market. Okay, next question. Will the failure of smaller banks allow larger banks to recover more rapidly despite Dodd-Frank? Well, yes and no. And I'm going to say it's going to allow all of the banks that aren't tiny to recover more quickly for 2 reasons. Number one, they'll get more of the deposit, and number two, because there won't be as much competition. So I think what you're going to see is less competition will actually be a good thing for the banking industry and for the consumers ultimately. And people say, well, you should get the lowest rate always. Yes and no. If the banking industry fails because the rates are too low, then that's not doing consumers any good. And I'm sure that there are many, many people that would say, I would have been willing to pay another few basis points or another quarter on my loan over the last few years so as not to force banks into a situation where they felt like they had to compete so extravagantly or to such a large degree, which was one of the reasons for the banking collapse. So yes, the larger banks will recover. I would say the banks, probably just based on what I'm seeing right now, are going to be those sort of mid-tier banks, the ones that are not your household banks. They tend, in my experience right now, they're getting most of the benefit from it. The larger banks are just, in many ways, confused. They're trying to implement things in a very large way, and of this new legislation, and they're having a very difficult time of it. I think that's going to continue. All right, let's see. I don't see any more questions here. We're right at 30 minutes, and I'd be glad to answer another one if one pops in, but I'll wait just a minute, or if I get the high sign. Let's see. Okay. Well, in conclusion here, I'll just wrap up by saying that we will come out of this. It will come out. It may not be this year. It may not be next year. But you will see housing prices start to increase. And in fact, when you see them increase, I think you're going to see some major inflation at some point, and that will lift the housing market. Again, that's my opinion. And once that happens, I think you'll be fine. But to all of you young folks out there, I'd say don't rush to buy a new house just because the market's low. Wait to buy a house until the time is right for you. Thanks to all. I've enjoyed being with you.